Welcome to acTVism Munich. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Thank you for joining us on a new show called Reconstructing Reality, where we will explore a wide range of issues and aim to provide a philosophical perspective on them. Joining us today is Phil Rockstroh, who is a poet, lyricist, and philosopher. He's also a regular contributor at Truthout, Trebuchet, and many other media outlets. Phil Rockstroh, thank you for joining us today.
Good to see you.
So let's start with ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The context, if we were to take the mainstream media and political consensus seriously, is number one, that they're an offshoot from Al-Qaeda and they basically grew out of that and have become bigger and bigger. And secondly, they adopted an extremist version of Islam. This has filled them with anger and rage, and thousands of people are now going about destroying cities. They're attacking Western values, and basically they have no compassion for human beings. So would you agree with this context that is coming out of the mainstream corporate media?
Well, of course, I'm not on the ground, but I know the Western media and the way they work by false narratives. And so, as you pointed out, a consensus seems to have built around that narrative. And if anybody that, for example, just scrolls down social media, they see one story after this, after another. And as we know, with the run-up to the war in Iraq, we know we were dealing with a litany of lies. So, of course, I'm going to approach this matter with a great deal of incredulity, and so I look to other media sources to find out. Since I'm not there, since it's not, this isn't my area of expertise, but I know how the Western propaganda machine works. We saw it in the former Yugoslavia. We see it constantly. So we end up with a mountain of corpses worldwide. You see the same thing happening with Nicaragua or anything that threatens Western imperialism. But I know from the get-go, if you go all the way back to the Ottoman Empire in that part of the world, people of the Islamic faith, Jews, Christians, coexisted relatively peacefully until the introduction of colonialism and imperialism to plunder the resources of the area. And then suddenly we hear constantly these false narratives, and in particular, as far as Palestine and the Zionist state go, these people have been at each other's throats. They're barbarians. We have to intervene. You get the interventionist liberal class that is constantly sowing these narratives. I mean, we know that the neocons are killer clowns. It's the liberal interventionists when they're in office that we kind of have to watch closely.
So the way the government has approached this, along with its allies, the US government has approached this, is to build a coalition and carry out airstrikes and also use on-ground proxy groups to combat ISIS. What do you think are the values that underpin this policy? And secondly, are there any other approaches that we could adopt which could end this perpetual cycle of violence in the Middle East?
Well, empires don't do that. I mean, I'm sitting here talking from an empire, and empires expand, and the second law of thermodynamics kick in, and you get this exponential insanity that begins to happen when you have a situation like that. So this empire, what lights up the city outside of my apartment at night are oil resources that somehow have to be plundered from around the world. And this is the story of how the map of what we arrogantly call in the West the Middle East. It's Middle East of Europe, as it's been pointed out. So what we in the West call the Middle East, and the whole area, the map was drawn by imperialism. That was the reason for it. And so the resources of the area would not benefit the people, but they would flow westward. So these divisions, we constantly hear stories of these barbaric hordes that threaten us. That's the narrative that we're talking about. We're talking about a story that's told so we can pretend we're civilized in the West. I mean, this is as what they consider high tea in Great Britain, when people all these civilized people would eat their crumpets and tea and sit there in the afternoon. This ability to do it came from imperialism, that there were slaves in the Caribbean that did not live past 30 years old because of a constant litany of exploitation, and their lives were destroyed, their backs were broken, they died appallingly young, so tea could flow back to Britain, the sugar could sweeten the tea, as another imperial project was going on in China and India that brought the tea to Great Britain. So these divisions, we're always hearing about one sect in front of another. It was happening right off, right outside across the Irish Channel. That the same thing happened with Protestants that came from Scotland and came into the north of Ireland and were used to turn Ireland into a plantation state. So I come from the deep South. I was born in Alabama. I was raised in Alabama and Georgia. It was a culture that came from Caribbean slave, set up by the same models, by the same people. So divisions were sowed where I was born in the Appalachian foothills in a city called Birmingham, Alabama, which is famous because Martin Luther King knew the kind of resentments, the kind of racial strife that had been sown in the white population. I mean, I witnessed my father, whose back was ruined for life because he had a job unloading trucks trains as they came into the city and left full of scrap metal, and he fell out of one of those trucks and his back was ruined for life. This is where I learned about colonialism and imperialism, because the money that came out of the ore of the Appalachian Mountains that stripped the land, that denuded it, that desold the population and made people angry and resentful. And those pictures you see coming back from Birmingham of people being cartwheeled down the street with hoses, being attacked by dogs, some of which were my father's because he took up photography after his back was ruined. And he began freelancing, and a number of his pictures went into Life magazine and went worldwide of the iconic pictures of that era. So I learned about what colonialism is, how the money went back to Pennsylvania that came from the hills around us, and the population saw almost none of it, and all we got in return were broken backs, lungs full of coal dust, and a lot of resentment and hatred. So I fully understand how the populations were divided so you could keep up that kind of enmity, so a narrative could be told about a barbaric place where they're inhuman. To this day, the liberal class tells a story about the South where you have broken, traumatized people down there that do say ridiculous things and don't work in their own interest and vote terribly and hold opinions that when you hear them, you're appalled by it. But living on the ground there, I can understand how somebody would join an organization that comes off as extremist in the West, because this is what colonialism does to the human psyche.
You talk about imperialism, but imperialism can only function with a certain amount of complicity coming from the local population. So you've been very active on social media, as well as you told us that you're coming from the southern states, so you know what the difference is, and now you're living in New York. Exactly. So tell us about the American attitude towards imperialism. Do you think the local population is aware of this sort of state that they're living in? And secondly, do you think the media even uses the term? Is there dissent that criticizes American foreign policy on that criteria?
Maybe if you go to Counterpunch or Consortium News or Common Dreams or any of the sites that I write for, you'll find a much more reality-inclined narrative. But the thing about having an imperialist colonialist model is it becomes internalized. This is a tremendous amount of trauma. And recent genetic studies have shown that trauma even passes down generations. The grandchildren of people who have been deeply traumatized, it will be passed in their genes. So what would you say about the awareness of an imperial colonialist model? No. It's internalized. The media holograph that surrounds us is just as manifest internally in our psyches. This is, it's no, like, let's go back to the Middle Ages. The church was internalized. Every thought people had came out of the church, or came out of an idea of the divine right of kings that God had bestowed on this king, this ability to translate the vision of God right and make it manifest across the earth. People internalize their social milieu, and our social milieu is one of colonization and imperial capitalism, really, because that's what does it. It builds up a psychical structure which is hyper-authoritarian in nature. All around us are office buildings that mirror the model of hierarchies, and they're really hierarchies of vampires that are there to suck the lifeblood. To use the story of Dracula, the average worker becomes a Renfield that loves master and just begs to have a pint of his blood taken every day and thinks they're going to be rewarded with what master has. Of course, that's never going to happen, and that causes a lot of resentment that has to be displaced and comes out in hideous opinions, and a lot of times comes out in a conflagration of blood.
Phil Rockstroh, poet, lyricist, and philosopher, thank you for joining us today.
It was a sincere sensation being here. I enjoyed myself.
And thank you for joining on our show called Reconstructing Reality. I'm your host, Zain Raza.